cost of borrowing just went up in the world's biggest economy, and it's prompting central banks all around the world to follow suit. Mobin Nasser reports on the impact of the US Federal Reserve's interest rate hike on other economies.
Finding a job in the United States seems to be getting easier, with unemployment there at its lowest in 17 years. The US Federal Reserve says the economy is in good shape, and it's decided to raise the benchmark interest rate to make sure prices don't rise too fast.
The U.S. economy is performing well. The growth that we're seeing, it's not based on, for example, an unsustainable buildup of debt as we had in the run-up to the financial crisis. The global economy is doing well. We're in a synchronized expansion. This is the first time in many years that we've seen this.
Higher rates help attract people and companies to shift their savings to the United States. But often, this is at the expense of developing economies, as many investors consider America to be a safer and more lucrative destination for their cash. So, central banks around the world are responding with rate hikes of their own. The People's Bank of China increased its 7-day repo rate by 5 basis points to 2.5% in a bid to discourage capital flight. The Hong Kong Monetary Authority matched the US rate hike, taking its base lending rate to 1.75%. And central banks in Saudi Arabia, Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates all followed suit within minutes of Janet Yellen's last news conference as the US Fed chairwoman. Turkey's central bank has also raised its overnight borrowing rate by 50 basis points. The decision is primarily aimed at curbing double-digit inflation.
Current elevated levels of inflation and recent developments in cost factors have increased the risks on expectations and the pricing behavior. Accordingly, the committee decided to tighten the monetary policy stance.
The central bank has been under pressure from the government to not raise the cost of borrowing, but its hand may be forced as rates rise in the US and Europe.
If US investments are perceived to have higher rates of return relative to, other markets, then absolutely one would expect to see a shift. The issue that you have, though, is a lot of developing economies, their investments take more risk.
For now, the European Central Bank does not appear keen to increase interest rates, but it says growth in the region has picked up, paving the way for monetary easing. When that happens, emerging economies like Turkey could face falling investments. Mobin Nasser, TRT World.
Now, joining me for more on this, I'm joined in the studio by Taha Arvas, who's a financial columnist here in Istanbul. Thanks so much for joining us, Taha.
No problem.
Now, let me start by asking you, Turkey's central bank only raised 1 of 4 of its benchmark rates. Is this enough to counter inflation, would you say?
I think so. The important thing is, of those 4 rates, only one of them is being used currently. So almost all of the lending is done at the late liquidity window. And so the increase there was meant to stem inflation, like you said, and I think it will be enough because while some were expecting a larger increase, I think that they will be happy with, they have been happy. Markets have reacted positively to this. I mean, the Turkish lira did drop a little bit against the US dollar, but not by the catastrophic amounts that people were predicting.
So not that much of a difference, would you say?
No, I don't. I mean, there will be a change in inflation. I mean, the central bank's mandate is to keep inflation in check, but employment is also an important part of this factor. So what they've done is they've raised it enough to the point where they think that inflation will slow, but not overdo it so that that the cost of borrowing will be cost prohibitive to companies.
Okay, and we know that the government and the president are really keen to keep interest rates low, but Turkey's last quarterly growth was a staggering 11%.
Right.
So the question is, does this create a risk of a credit bubble?
That's a good question. Of that 11%, 7% of that came from household spending. The other 4% came from investments. So household spending, consumer consumption, is very important for Turkey. Just like the United States, something like more than two-thirds of the total GDP comes from consumer consumption. So what the government wants interest rates to be low, as do most governments, because they answer to the people. Their elections, people vote on their records, and if interest rates are too high, then the cost of doing business is too high, your credit card bills are too high, and so obviously the people don't want that. So it's a delicate balance, but I think the central bank may have gotten it correct this time.
Okay, thanks so much for your time and for coming into the studio. That was Taha Arvas, a financial columnist here in Istanbul.